Hi everyone, thank you so much for coming tonight. We're going to get started in a few minutes, so just hang tight for a little bit. Just to start off, my name is Cherry Pham. I am a Conservation Nebraska member serving with AmeriCorps. Conservation Nebraska is a statewide nonprofit organization, and we are committed to Nebraska's natural legacy. And we do a lot of educational programs such as this one, and we hope that you enjoy it tonight. In a minute, I'm going to have Lindsey Chizinski, the speaker tonight, introduce herself, and she is presenting on biodiversity in the Heartland. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you to Conservation Nebraska and AmeriCorps for having me here tonight. I've been looking forward to this. I can't tell how many people are online. Do we have? Nice. Okay. Well, thanks for joining us. I think most everyone is joining via Zoom tonight, but I appreciate everyone who's in the room too. As Cherry said, we'll be talking about biodiversity in Nebraska and what that means and why it's important and why it's so relevant to any conversation about conservation. But first, I want to introduce myself. I'm here representing the School of Natural Resources at UNL. It's on the East Campus here in Lincoln. And just a little bit of background about myself. I am a Nebraska native. I spent most of my life in Nebraska, the very beginning of my life, born in Omaha, I was raised in the eastern part of the state, right by the Missouri River. After I lived in Omaha, I moved up to Fort Calhoun, which is just north of Omaha, and had this really idyllic, wild and free childhood exploring the bluffs around the river and the river bottoms, the floodplains of the Missouri, and then moved to Lincoln to come to school. And I never really left after that. So I've been here more than 20 years now, and I've worked in a variety of natural resources roles here in Lincoln, from working as a fish biologist with the state of Nebraska for the Game and Parks Commission to my current position at the School of Natural Resources as a professor of ecology and also teaching ichthyology classes, fish biology courses, environmental education courses, and then I get to study abroad with students as well, taking them to the Bahamas to study marine ecology. And coming up in 2026, we'll be going to Namibia. So I see Cherry's like, yes. Cherry's going to be in my ecology class this fall. I'm looking forward to that too. I also manage a lab where we research conservation and biodiversity around aquatic organisms, primarily fish. And I have, if you're interested in looking at more into that, what we do at our lab, here's a link to, there's the URL up on the screen and also a QR code that'll take you to my lab page and give you a little more information about the research that we do there. Currently, I have about 200 200 pallid sturgeons in the lab. They're an endangered fish species, federally endangered, a large river species that occupy our Missouri River and its tributaries. So we're doing some research on their gut microbiomes and how that influences fishes that are raised in hatcheries and then stocked into the Missouri River to support the wild populations that are endangered. So if I have time at the end of the talk, maybe I'll get back to that a little bit. But let's move on and talk about biodiversity. Before we get into that conversation, I do want to acknowledge that the University of Nebraska is a land-grant institution with campuses and programs on the past, present, and future homelands of the Pawnee, Ponca, Oto-Missouri, Omaha, Lakota, Dakota, Arapaho, Cheyenne, and Kaw peoples, as well as the relocated Ho-Chunk, Iowa, and Sac and Fox peoples. And I just want to acknowledge that the land we're on, where we gather today, is the traditional territory of the Oto-Missouri. So what is biodiversity? What are the components that make up biodiversity? And again, why is it important? And I thought, based on what I spent my weekend doing, I have a little anecdote to kind of introduce this story, because I was thinking about this talk as I was working in my yard this weekend. So this is a picture of an ornamental plum tree. I had one in my backyard that was really large and beautiful, and was kind of a focal point of my landscaping in my backyard until the storm that hit Friday night or early Saturday morning, which took it down. And this is an actual picture of that tree. It ended up on my neighbor's garage and in her yard. And I spent the entire weekend along with my neighbor and family chopping that thing up and moving it down to Star City Shores, where the city was accepting some of the debris from the storm. But as we were getting to the end of that process, and we had all the limbs off and all the branches cleared, and we were clearing out the trunk, and then I was going around the perimeter of where the trunk was situated on my property and cutting out some of those suckers that were coming up from the root system and kind of just disturbing the soil, I was noticing all of these incredible interactions with the root system of that tree. These big, fat, juicy, like blue ribbon earthworms, like the best, like I was like, I need to collect these and go fishing. Best looking earthworms. And then I was seeing this fungal network, this really thread-like white fungus that was kind of moving through the soil. Invertebrates, like I saw some, what are they called? The really noisy ones. I'm just blanking now. The cicadas. I saw some cicadas that were still in the ground associated with that root system that hadn't come out from the ground yet. A bunch of different beetle larvae, just all of these invertebrates and fungus and bacteria I can't see, but I was starting to think of those things that were associated in the soil with the root system of this plum tree that was now gone. And I was thinking about how the absence of that tree was going to change this micro ecosystem in my backyard, and not just in terms of like the hostas that I need to replant and move to a shadier spot now that the shade of that tree is gone, but what is happening in the soil around that tree, the microorganisms and the invertebrates that are processing nutrients and enriching the soil, and the moisture content of the soil, how all of that's going to change in the absence of a really vital part of that system on a very small scale. And so here's just a figure of kind of that thought process of my mind was taking when I was digging up all of those roots of the brown food web, which is what those processes that take place in the soil that break down nutrients, the decomposers and the detritivores that help move nutrients through the system, make them available to plants and then to the rest of the food web. And this was really relevant to my thoughts about this talk about biodiversity, because what is important to think about when we look at food webs and systems with all these different species in them is what can be, when something is missing from that system, when something's removed from that system, whether it's because of a disturbance like a natural event like a windstorm or whatever the case, is there something else that can come in and take the place of that role as either a producer or a consumer in the system and allow that system to remain stable, or will the system change because of the absence of that thing? So we're going to step back a little bit and talk about a definition of biodiversity, and then I'll revisit that concept again later in this talk. But biodiversity really isn't just the diversity of species. That's, I think, what we always think of first, is all the species in an ecosystem or in a landscape. But it's also genetic diversity within populations of those species, and it's landscape diversity. So what does the ecosystem look like? What does the landscape support in terms of all the species that can inhabit it? So it's a combination of all these things that interact with each other. And I'll spend a little bit of time talking about all three of these. But first, And like I said, what comes to mind first is species diversity. And so here's just another illustration of a grassland food web, just to illustrate all of the different species that come to mind when we're thinking about this type of ecosystem. We think of all the plant species that we'd see in a grassland. We think of everything that eats the plants and the things that eat the organisms that eat the plants. So the producers that capture the energy and the primary consumers, all the way up to those apex predators like the wolf, or those large kind of sexy megafauna consumers like a bison or an elk, which have been removed extirpated from the grassland system. In this diagram, this was one that was produced by the state of Iowa, I believe. And so all of those larger organisms are no longer part of those grasslands in Iowa. Species diversity is really easy to think about when we think about the plants and the vertebrates that we're really familiar with, but it goes beyond just the vertebrates. It goes beyond the birds. It goes beyond the mammals, even beyond the insects that we're familiar with, the spiders and the crickets and the beetles. And it incorporate everything in this tree of life. So everything from bacteria to the fungi I mentioned that I was seeing around the tree roots, to the worms, and in aquatic systems, the phytoplankton and the zooplankton, all of those arthropods, the insects and crustaceans, mollusks, and the vertebrates, and all of the plants. All of those things are included in species diversity and should be included when we think about species diversity. And it may be surprising to some people if you look at kind of an estimate of what makes up life on planet Earth, that most of that diversity in terms of numbers of species falls in that insect realm. And if you see chordates, I wonder if I don't know if that'll show up on the Zoom or not, but that just makes up a little slice of the pie. And even bacteria, not as much of the representation as insects and other invertebrates. So they really, all of those little things that we can't see or that we tend to forget about are really important to biodiversity and successfully functioning systems. So of all those species, what do we have in Nebraska? We have an estimated 30,000 insects, 85 fish species, 13 amphibians, 9 turtles, 39 other reptiles, around 400 bird species, and that includes those that are just here temporarily as they migrate to summer or winter grounds. Close to 100 mammals, 89 mammals, mollusks, snails, and mussels. Currently about 49, although we've lost a lot of mussels to extinction. Oligochaetes, the earthworms, 25, 15,000 plants, and more odds and ends that I'll mention a couple of them in a few minutes. But we have a very diverse set of species in our state. And I'm going to highlight just a few here. So here, the fish on the upper left of your screen, this is a sturgeon chub. This bat is a northern long-eared bat. These little grubs, anybody familiar with what those might be? Can be a little deceiving. These are actually the larvae of the American burying beetle. And then down here, the western Massasauga, Nebraska's smallest rattlesnake, scale shell mussel, and a piping plover. All of these share something in common. Guess what it is? I don't have access to the Zoom, so if you're commenting, I'll have to have someone relay that to me. They're all, they're all endangered or threatened in the state of Nebraska or federally. So Nebraska has a list of species that are at risk for extinction, at least locally. And there are different tiers of importance in terms of conservation for these groups, for these species. Tier 1 is at risk for extinction. Tier 2 is more threatened and but not as extremely at risk for extinction as Tier 1 species. But currently, there are 89 species that fall within that Tier 1 category. And this slide breaks up all those different groups. And what I'm going to back up for a minute and just show this slide again. Oh no, what happened? Maybe we don't back up. But I want you to think about, let's see if I can get back to, wow. Okay, what happened? Okay, we're going to go there. What might happen in the systems that these organisms live in if they were gone? So they're all at risk for extinction. Try and think about what the sturgeon chub, what role it plays in its ecosystem and how that ecosystem might function in its absence. Same thing with the mussels, the Massasauga, the burying beetle. What other organisms might be able to step in and play the same role that it plays in the diverse food web of its system within its trophic level that it occupies? And if there's not something that can readily fill that role, what would that system look like? Would the system change to something else? And then just moving further with all 89 of those species in Nebraska, what might happen when we pull those away from these systems and remove them from these systems, or when they become so scarce that they can no longer fulfill that ecosystem role within the food webs? And just as an aside here, we're not going to spend a lot of time on this, but the reason for all of these species being listed at risk for extinction, I'm not going to go back to that slide again because I don't want to mess it up, but in the case of the aquatic species, habitat alteration with damming and channelization of rivers, changing the turbidity of the water, changing the flow, changing the temperature of the water, habitat alterations for the American burying beetle. Habitats have changed so much with development of agricultural land that they rely on carrion. So they process nutrients by eating dead animals, processing those nutrients in the soil, but those dead animals become a lot less available on a larger landscape as we homogenize the landscape for agriculture. So all of these things are that threaten these species and cause them to be listed as at risk for extinction come back to human influences. And you're probably familiar with this term, the Anthropocene, but there's a lot of debate on whether currently, when we look at the scale of geologic time and all of these different periods like the Triassic and the Jurassic, that we're entering this new time frame called the Anthropocene, where we will see another mass extinction. So in this diagram, there's these red stars that are recognizing different periods in history and geologic time where mass extinction has happened because of some natural event like an asteroid hitting the Earth, or the tilt of the Earth changes, or there's different reasons throughout these 5 mass extinctions that have caused species diversity to shrink back and then rebound after on a large geologic scale to rebound over time. And so there's this debate now on whether we are in this human-induced 6th mass extinction. And the term for that is the Anthropocene, because of all of the extinctions that are happening due to climate change, due to the modification of landscapes to suit human needs. So it's sobering, and we won't spend too much time on that tonight because I want to continue to talk about the importance of biodiversity and the beauty of the biodiversity that we have in Nebraska. So to lighten things up just a little bit, I'm going to highlight just a couple of weird things that we have in Nebraska that I wasn't familiar with growing up, or in the case of this one, until just last year when my son found this in a puddle when we were out in Valentine for a wedding. And I think, let's see if I can get the video to play. Nope, darn it. Maybe it will. So this is outside of our hotel, and they found this worm wriggling around in a puddle after a rainstorm, this long little horsehair worm. The funny thing is, so this is parasitic, we learned after we looked it up, but it's only parasitic for invertebrates that live in the water and not a threat to my kid. But he was so convinced that he had found a new species and we then discovered something new and he was so excited. And of course, a quick Google search made it evident that he had not discovered a new species, but they were very excited about it. And they actually took this, they got it like a Dixie cup and put some water in it and took the worm to the wedding. Had it with them through the whole wedding and then brought it back to the hotel and put it back in the puddle at the end of the night. So they're the Nematomorpha genus, but they're not actually nematodes. So nematodes are a different kind of worm that are very prevalent. But these are a fully different, not related worm, parasitic worm. You might not have known we had in Nebraska. Here's another interesting organism you might not have known we had in Nebraska. It's a jellyfish. I had no idea that freshwater jellyfish even existed, and let alone existed in Nebraska, until I was doing my master's research and sampling lakes on the Interstate 80 corridor. And I saw these, they're really small. I think I have a really small, about the size of a penny, but I saw just a whole bunch of these in the lake one day. And it's like, is that jellyfish? Sure enough, it is. They are an introduced species. I think they are native to Asia. I don't know a whole lot about them, but they have moved throughout the United States. They're not invasive. They don't cause any disruption to ecosystems that I know of, and not in Nebraska for sure. But we do have them along the Interstate 80 corridor and some of those sandpit lakes and gravel pit lakes. So keep an eye out if you're out there. That's really cool. Okay, so let's talk about genetic diversity for a minute. So we've moved on from the species diversity component of overall biodiversity to speaking about genetic diversity. And I want to just use this case study of the greater prairie chicken to illustrate this. So when I talk about genetic diversity, I'm referring to the gene pool of a population. So all of the genes in any population, humans, for example, we have the population of Lincoln. We have, we're all humans. We all have generally the same characteristics, but we have different genetic influences that make us more or less susceptible to diseases. You know, some of us get deathly ill if we get COVID. Some of us barely even know that we have it. And so that's what I'm talking about when I refer to genetic diversity, is that the gene pool within a population that allows some organisms to be able to withstand disturbances better than others or worse than others. That diversity is really important to populations being able to sustain themselves. And the prairie chicken, the greater prairie chicken, is a great example of reduced genetic diversity and what happens when genetic diversity within populations is reduced. So in kind of the southwest and central part of Nebraska of these prairie chicken populations, but most of its historic range, which is that lighter shaded area, they're no longer present in. And once again, it is a result of landscape alteration and habitat loss. But when that started happening with all of these subpopulations of this larger this larger continental population, is that the genetic diversity of those populations was reduced as those population sizes shrunk. And it's called a bottlenecking effect. And here's kind of just a conceptual illustration of what that looks like. Here in the original population with all these different colored beads, that represents a wider variety of genetic diversity. And what happens in the bottlenecking event, where in the case of the prairie chickens, loss of habitat led to smaller population sizes locally. Those existing populations that were left had less genetic diversity just by random chance of those that survived pass on their genes to offspring and the persisting population. And so they are much more susceptible to diseases and pests, and those populations have never really been able to reestablish, even though prairie chickens have been able to utilize our altered landscapes successfully in some places, depending on what the management of those landscapes are. Those populations are so susceptible to disease that they are failing. And so this is a great example of a lack of genetic diversity within populations that is influenced by the landscape diversity. And then is overall, over time, it's influencing species diversity as this species is less and less abundant throughout its historic range. A cool thing about prairie chickens, though, is that in Nebraska, the populations that we have much relatively greater diversity, genetic diversity, than those in some of the other parts of its range where there still are populations. And so I've been able to, when I worked for Game and Parks a couple times, go out and help with these efforts to capture and transplant some of our prairie chickens to other populations to increase the genetic diversity of those other populations and help them to rebound. So we're really lucky to have great prairie chicken populations in some parts of the state. And there's actually a lot of ecotourism that's built up around those because they do this really cool early spring mating ritual where they gather together on these lecking grounds, and the males put on this big courtship display. That's what this picture is here, where they puff out their cheeks and they do these funny dances and they make this really crazy otherworldly sound that's just incredible to watch. So if you ever have an opportunity to participate in some of that prairie chicken viewing, I would highly recommend it. It was kind of influential in my career in ecology and in natural resources. I got to go out with the current director of our department, Larkin Powell, when he was a new professor and I was an undergraduate student at UNL, and see this one morning. And it just really, I think, committed me, it was inspiring, committed me to pursuing a career in natural resources. So moving on to that third component of biodiversity, it's landscape diversity. And here's just an image from the Natural Legacy Project, the Nebraska Natural Legacy Project, that's housed on the Nebraska Game and Parks Commission website, supported by Nebraska Game and Parks Commission, by federal dollars with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the Nebraska Environmental Trust. But within these broader ecoregions of Nebraska, the Natural Legacy Project identifies these biologically unique landscapes that are either have landscapes that are very unique within the state, or those landscapes are supporting species that are very unique within the state. And they are singled out for and highlighted for conservation and management practices that will protect biodiversity in those regions. But before we get into those biologically unique landscapes, and I'm not going to go through all of them, but I just want to highlight them, let's talk about those broader ecoregions. So we have 4 broad ecoregions represented in Nebraska: the tallgrass prairie here in eastern Nebraska, which is big blue stem, little blue stem, I'm covered up here on my notes, a variety of tallgrass species. And a good example, if you're from the Lincoln area and you've ever had a chance to go out to 9 Mile Prairie, just north of town, right by the airport, really beautiful example of a remnant tallgrass prairie, which is what this whole part of our state used to look like. The Sandhills prairies, these are also prairie ecosystems that are very different from our tallgrass prairie ecosystems because they're built on this windblown sand dunes that grasses have stabilized over time. So very different species composition and some really unique characteristics in that region. And then the short grass prairies of western Nebraska. image on that one. These are more arid landscapes, and so we see different, again, just different grass species in the western part, panhandle part of the state. And then this kind of mixed grass prairie where we see species that are representative of both tall and short grass prairies, along with that Platte River corridor in the south central Nebraska. So those are the broad ecoregions. But within those, we have all of these really unique landscapes like the Sandhills Lakes up in the Sandhills ecoregion, Sand Sage Prairie also in that area, wetlands throughout the state and many different types of wetlands. And I won't have time to go into all of those tonight, but I will direct you to a resource that has really cool wetlands information that was put together by the Platte River Basin Time Lapse group out of UNL and the Game and Parks Commission in collaboration. We have oak savanna woodlands in the eastern part of the state, following those riparian areas, cedar canyons of the panhandle in the southwest part of the state. So all of these beautiful ecoregions that many people don't even know exist in Nebraska, these biologically unique landscapes. A lot of people think Nebraska looks only like this. In fact, my sister sent me a Instagram reel this morning of someone looking out of their hotel window being like, yay, the beautiful landscapes of Nebraska. And she looking out on something like this. And one of my colleagues, Dennis Ferraro, who actually made up that last slide, I should give him the credit for that. He had also this slide with a quote from E.O. Wilson, who's just a very prolific naturalist, came up with a lot of ecological concepts like biogeography and did a lot of really, really interesting research and published a lot of really great books about animal behavior. He really loved to study ants and how they interacted and worked as eusocial insects. But he has this quote that to the lazy or untrained hunter, the woods are always empty. And I think that's really relevant to the biodiversity and the diverse landscapes of Nebraska. If you don't get off the beaten path, and if you're just driving down Interstate 80, maybe that is all you see is this kind of barren concrete landscape and barren harvested fields. But we have a lot more to offer. And that's where these Nebraska's Natural Legacy Project, biologically unique landscapes, that tries to highlight some of those areas and highlight the species that are supported by those landscapes. And I just pulled one out just as an example here. This is in the way southeast corner of the state, the Southeast Prairie BUL. And in this image that's zoomed up here is just a kind of a general distinction between different habitat types in that ecoregion or that BUL, showing the connectivity of, there's both ag land, mostly it's ag land, but there's quite a bit of tall grass prairie there. There's forested areas, there's wetland riparian zones. And this map is showing the connections and the gaps between those different areas or the different composition of that landscape. And you can even zoom in further between or further into those general, grassland or woodland or riparian area habitat types and get even more specific with that. But I am not going to be able to pull this up. I wanted to show this GIS map that's interactive and available to anyone to be able to investigate all of these different biologically unique landscapes. So I have the URL up there and I have a QR code that you can access this on your own time and look into each of those. You won't see that map with the different habitats, but what you will see is a list of species that are represented in those areas and management practices that will support diversity in those areas, and also places that you can visit to see some of those management practices underway and successful management for conservation in all of those different areas. So it's really useful and it's really cool to just identify what's present in all these different regions in terms of not just wildlife, but the grassland species and what different habitats are there. like we saw with that Southeast prairie, the diversity of prairie and woodland interspersed throughout pretty dominant cropland. There's still quite a bit of habitat there that isn't altered. And it still has pretty good connectivity. And that's one of the things about the Natural Legacy Project, is one of the things it's highlighting is let's preserve that connectivity. Let's preserve that connectivity between all of these remnant pieces of habitat so that they can be utilized at a larger landscape for species. And one other thing I wanted to point out, that section there, that Southeast prairie, is the home to the Massasauga, one of those endangered species that I highlighted a little bit earlier. That's where you'll find those rattlesnakes. So if you're adventurous, you can go look for them down there. So I wanted to talk a little bit about sources of landscape diversity. What makes landscapes diverse? And it's a lot of things. It's the abiotic components of a landscape. So climate, but not just climate, the topography of the land, the elevation, slope of the elevation, the aspect, what direction is a slope facing? Is it getting a lot of sunlight? Is it protected from sunlight so that there's more moisture in the soil? Is it upland and drier, or is it lowland and getting runoff? All of those things introduce heterogeneity or diversity into a landscape. Just the soils that are present are both, they're determined in part by the bedrock, what's underneath the soils, but also by the biotic interactions that are happening in the soils, like I was talking about with the plum tree in my backyard. The soil, in large part, was the soil content and the soil moisture levels were influenced by the organisms that are living in the soils. The water table, how close it is to the surface, so how much water is being accessed, is accessible by plants, and what type of plants can persist in different levels of the water table. So all of these abiotic things influence landscape diversity. And then those interactions of the organisms that are living there that are supported by all of those abiotic components. And of course, human land use, not just present land use, but past land use, really shapes the diversity of our landscapes too, as we can see in this picture. And then disturbance and succession, which I'll come back to in just a minute. But all of these things are influencing, again, like I said, the heterogeneity of a landscape, which is analogous to the diversity of a landscape, which directly relates to species diversity. And again, when we were looking at this, in a second, this map, this GIS map of that Southeast prairie, and we were looking at those different general habitats within that area. There we go. I was talking about this a little bit already, but the presence and abundance of those different habitats, and then how connected are they to each other, and how dense are those habitats? So how available are those patchy pieces of habitat to organisms to use? If they are really disconnected from each other, they're not very useful to populations, to organisms. But if there's connectivity between them, they can still be utilized and increase biodiversity of species that occupy them. So succession and disturbance are really important to landscape diversity. And here's just an example of grassland succession. So after a disturbance, after there's a fire or a harvest or grazing, then there's this process of a prairie, a grassland establishing, where you start off with annual grasses and forbs, moving to perennials, eventually into a young forest, and then mature old growth forests over a longer period of time. This, in a larger landscape, if you have different stages of succession represented in one landscape, that increases that landscape diversity, that increases the overall biodiversity of a landscape. And those processes of disturbance, which used to be natural causes, have been largely replaced now by managed systems like managed fire or managed grazing in our grasslands. And I think I have a video, if I can remember how to play that. This is a really short video outside of our building in Heartland Hall last spring semester. We did a grazing demonstration, bringing some cattle out from animal science to graze the prairie at Heartland Hall, to just talk about how these processes of disturbance can introduce heterogeneity, but it has to be really mindful, because we have to think about having different stages of disturbance within one landscape so that we don't have homogeneous landscape that's all been burned at the same time and is all at the same stage of succession, because that will decrease biodiversity, because it's not allowing for as many species to occupy those spaces when those spaces are all the same. So it's the soils, it's the interactions of disturbance and succession, it's the interactions of all the organisms that are living in that landscape that overall contribute to that biodiversity. Stuck here on this slide now. There we go. And to get back to the beginning, why that's important, why the biodiversity is important when we talk about conservation, is because it influences resistance and resilience in communities. So resistance is a measure of how much a community, an ecological community, will change when it's acted upon by disturbance. And resilience is the amount of disturbance that a system can absorb before it crosses a threshold and organizes itself into something else. So in this conceptual diagram, we look at that transition between a grassland to a woodland, so moving along that succession timeline. And the diagram has this kind of depression with a red ball in it. And then there's a deeper depression. And what I want you to conceptualize is that red ball being moved from some disturbance. So being altered from its grassland state from some disturbance, but it will eventually move back to its grassland state over time. And how long that takes is kind of how resistant, it's determined by how resistant a community is. But at some point, there's this threshold where the disturbance is so great that it reorganizes into a different state. It becomes a woodland, it stays a woodland. So we're thinking, if we're moving along that line of succession and there hasn't been a fire disturbance in a grassland for like 10 years, there's so many woody species that have started in the grassland that a fire does come through, and a lot of those woody species are developed enough that they survive. And so the woodland state persists, and it takes an incredible amount of energy to move that ball back into that other depression, into that grassland state. And so this idea of resilience of systems is, this concept is really relevant to biodiversity, because when you have increased biodiversity of landscapes, of species, that increased genetic diversity in your systems, they are much more resilient to those disturbances, and they can remain in the state that they are, even if it takes time to get back to that state. The resilience is heightened, and so we don't move as readily from one stable state to another. And the question might come up, why is there a problem with a grassland moving to a woodland? You know, is one stable state more desirable than another? And it's a good question. And I hate to always put like an economic value to things, because I think that there is intrinsic value in these systems existing without how we benefit from them. But there is a very real, there's a very real impact on the systems that we rely on, the ecological goods and services that we rely on out of the systems that we live in. We've built our infrastructure around, they've been very predictable in our lifetimes. And if those change, and the system reorganizes into something new, that's going to be very impactful to all of the systems that we have, all of the economic systems we have that rely on these ecological goods and services. And you know, our croplands are a very good example. We have a climate in Nebraska that we know exactly what crops and how to optimize our crops under that climate, but that climate is changing, and it's changing really quickly, becoming probably a different stable state, a different type of a system. And with the resilience of our systems lowered, then we end up in that different stable state, and we're not prepared economically to deal with that. So just putting it in a human perspective and an economic perspective, it's very worth considering to conserve the biodiversity of our systems in a larger scale, and not just our agricultural systems, but to conserve that species diversity and that landscape diversity, so that in the face of disturbances like climate change, our systems can respond. And I think we're getting close to running out of time. I want to save some time for questions. But again, just bringing this image back up of this food web and the prairie food web and everything that interacts, all of the species interacting, and what can happen when we pull species out of that picture. And when we remove enough of the primary consumers, for example, when we remove enough in that trophic level that the system reorganizes into something else, or we remove enough of the producers that the primary consumers become different species, and the system organizes itself into something different. That something different isn't always necessarily a bad thing. Like, that is a process of succession. But what does that mean to the landscapes of Nebraska? What does it mean to those biologically unique landscapes that we protect, and the species that are supported by those landscapes? So I want to highlight a couple other resources that I think are really important or useful for investigating what we have for landscape diversity in Nebraska. So the first was the Natural Legacy Project. And I mentioned this already once, but the Platte Basin Time Lapse has wonderful storytelling projects from their team investigating the unique landscapes of Nebraska, the aquatic landscapes, but also the terrestrial landscapes. This is where you can find a link to the wetlands storytelling projects that is a collaboration with the Nebraska Game and Parks Commission, talking about all of our unique wetlands and how important, how vital they are to so many species in our state, including us. So I recommend visiting that. And because of our connection on the Zoom connection, I'm not going to pull that up and navigate it, because I don't think it'll work very well or translate very well to Zoom. But here it is for you to investigate on your own. And I'm going to skip this. This is my pallid sturgeon talk, but we're running out of time. So let me just skip through that. And I had, where is it at? I can get this to come up. Here are a couple other really good resources that UNL has. Just thinking about what you can do to increase biodiversity in your own spaces, in your own yards, or on your own property. There's the Nebraska Statewide Arboretum at plantnebraska.org. They offer tons of resources on how to have sustainable landscapes in your yards, and Backyard Farmer and other extension services, whether you're looking at just your vegetable gardens or your flower gardens or whatever landscaping you have in urban areas, to more rural areas where you're looking at acreages and you have maybe crops and farmland. We have so many resources through Nebraska Extension that can help you manage those for conservation and for sustainability of biodiversity, which again is just vital to conservation practices, that the biodiversity of species, of landscapes, maintaining that heterogeneity of landscapes, and that genetic diversity of the populations that we have in Nebraska. Really fantastic resources, again, through Extension, through the Statewide Arboretum, through the School of Natural Resources. And I am happy to help direct anyone to individuals. If you have specific interests on how to manage your properties, I can direct you in the School of Natural Resources and in the in Kasner and IANR, so the broader Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources on East Campus here at UNL. So please reach out to me and I can help direct you to any of those people. But that's going to wrap things up. I think I don't have time to talk anymore about my pallet sturgeon, but maybe I can come back another time and talk about them. So if there's any questions from Zoom, maybe I can get those from Cherry and answer them. Anyone here has questions I can try to answer? Okay, yeah, if you want to put questions in the chat, then I can try and answer them for you here. Yeah.
How would you get around like how HOA is very like strict with like what you can put in your front yard and your backyard?
So the question is, what are some how to deal with HOAs who sometimes have really strict rules about what can be in yards. And I've seen this over the years I've lived in Lincoln. People get in trouble for having like sunflowers in their front yard that are obstructing views, or that the HOA thinks maybe doesn't look manicured enough. That's a really good question. I would advocate for being active on the HOA and bringing, I think, education and just bringing to light the importance of having native plants that don't require as much water usage. So that gives it an economic, there's a value to planting in native plants because they don't require as much maintenance. That can be an attractive thing, but just educating on the importance of the biodiversity of native plants in our yards and how that directly influences all of these other components of the food web of the ecosystem. I think just being active and talking about it is probably the best way to confront some of those maybe pre-existing notions that manicured lawns are the only way to present your yard. I'm really lucky that I don't live in a place that has an HOA. Yeah, I might not.
So like a lot of people who do prescribe burning, it's like with the intention for not as much for biodiversity, but for like knocking out invasive species. So it's like the goal is like we're gonna knock out the sleepy spurge, which like I think burning in little sections is better for like the biodiversity. But then you still have like this really aggressive invasive species. So like, do you have any thoughts on like how to handle an area that is like has really strong invasive species and people will just like burn it like a lot, but then it's also like taking away the biodiversity kind of.
Right.
I don't know if you have
Yeah, so the question was that sometimes burns are to manage for invasive species. So it's like a wide scale burn rather than doing patchy burns, which the patchy burns can increase that heterogeneity of the landscape, which then, like we were talking about, leads to increased species diversity, but it doesn't solve the problem of these really aggressive invasive species. So what is the solution to both supporting biodiversity and also controlling the spread of invasives with burning? And I don't have a good answer to that. I think it would be just off the top of my head, probably finding some kind of a burn regimen that is taking out big tracts of the invasives like the red cedars or the leafy spurge, but still doing it on a rotation so that you're allowing different stages of succession. Even within a short scale, it can make a big difference. So even if it's like you burn once in the spring and you burn again the next spring, a different section, and you just keep it on that rotation annually or biannually, you're still controlling and knocking back some of those invasives, but allowing for some of that, those different levels of succession to be taking place in the larger landscape at the same time. And I would, if anyone's interested in that specific problem or a solution to that specific problem, the Crawl Center, I think I had a quote from the Crawl Center up there. That's on East Campus. It's the Center for, I can't remember the acronym right now, but it's like Agricultural Working Lab, Resilience and Agricultural Working Landscapes. And they do a lot of research on fire and fire as a disturbance mechanism that allows people to still utilize their landscapes as in agriculture or for grazing and ranching, but maintain biodiversity within those landscapes too. And so I would direct you to that center, the Crawl Center on East Campus at UNL, for more information about burning regimens. Another person actually that is doing some really cool research on burning and timing of burns is Chris Helzer with the Prairie Nature Conservancy in the Niobrara. What is it? The Niobrara River. Yeah. They're doing some really cool research on the timing and rotation of disturbances through burning and grazing together, and doing both of those different kinds of disturbance.
I have a question.
Yes. I can't.
Burning rates are led by, are they private, university system led, or are they green lit by local government and property owners? Are these controlled efforts at risk of being shut down with new zoning laws and redefining of protected habitats?
So I think the question is kind of getting at who organizes controlled burns, and is there any risk to those happening with zoning laws and basically the interface of urban areas and this is how I'm translating it, the interface between urban areas and these burns. And it's a really great question because you'll notice often in the spring we get smoke and reduced air quality here in Lincoln because of burns that happen in Kansas. And so there is a real impact of doing burns on human populations that are sometimes not even that close to where those burns are happening. But that's, I don't have the answer to what the future of burning looks like in terms of how it impacts human populations. I think burning and grazing together can be a very good solution so that you're minimizing just using burning, but also just planning well for when you burn and what direction winds are going is important too. But I am not an expert in any of that. We have a Center for Grassland Studies at UNL that does do also a lot of research on this. And I think that would be, they direct a lot of the trainings for doing burns. Usually it is volunteers who come and get trained to do these prescribed burns, and then they can go out to, at the request of landowners, to go out and burn their properties. So it's that, you know, we're largely a privately owned state. Property is privately owned. So it's at the landowner's discretion what things get burned and when they get burned and how often. And they can access resources through the university to have people come out and do those burns with them. I hope that answered the question.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Just once again, there is a survey that should have popped up on your screen. It would be very much appreciated if you took the time. It's a very short survey. And thank you to Lindsey for speaking for us tonight and taking the time. And thank you for all of you guys for coming out tonight. we're probably gonna end the webinar in just a few minutes. If you have any questions, would you mind if I like sent your email out afterwards? Okay, perfect. I'll send her email out if you have any more questions. And then if you guys want to talk to an AmeriCorps conservation director, I'll also send an email out following this event to like if you want to have a conversation with the conservation director, that's what we're here for. So thank you everyone for coming.